The bunkhouse was a long, rectangular building. Inside, the walls were whitewashed and the floor unpainted. In 3 walls, there were small, square windows, and in the 4th, a solid door with a wooden latch. Against the walls were 8 bunks, 5 of them made up with blankets and the other 3 showing their burlap ticking. Over each bunk there was nailed an apple box with the opening forward so that it made 2 shelves for the personal belongings of the occupant of the bunk. And these shelves were loaded with little articles: soap and talcum powder, razors, and those Western magazines ranch men love to read and scoff at and secretly believe. And there were medicines on the shelves, and little vials, combs, and from nails on the box sides, a few neckties. Near one wall there was a black cast-iron stove, its stovepipe going straight up through the ceiling. In the middle of the room stood a big square table littered with playing cards, and around it were grouped boxes for the players to sit on. At about 10 o'clock in the morning the sun threw a bright dust-laden bar through one of the side windows, and in and out of the beam flies shot like rushing stars. The wooden latch raised. The door opened and a tall, stoop-shouldered old man came in. He was dressed in blue jeans and he carried a big push broom in his left hand. Behind him came George, and behind George, Lenny. "The boss was expectin' you last night," the old man said. "He was sore as hell when you wasn't here to go out this morning." He pointed with right arm, and out of the sleeve came a round stick. "Like wrist, but no hand. You can have them 2 beds there," he said, indicating 2 bunks near the stove. George stepped over and threw his blankets due on the burlap sack of straw that was a mattress. He looked into his box shelf and then picked a small yellow can from it. "Say, what the hell's this?" "I don't know," said the old man. "Says positively kills lice, roaches and other scourges." "What the hell kind of bed you giving us, anyways? We don't want no pants." "Rabbits." The old swamper shifted his broom and held it between his elbow and his side while he held out his hand for the can. He studied the label carefully. "Tell you what, Dash," he said finally, "last guy that had this bed was a blacksmith, hell of a nice fella and clean a guy as you want to meet. Used to wash his hands even after he ate." "Then how come he got graybacks?" George working up a slow anger. Lenny put his bindle on the neighboring bunk and sat down. He watched George with open mouth. "Tell you what," said the old swamper. "This here blacksmith, name of Whitey, was the kind of guy that would put that stuff around even if there wasn't no bugs, just to make sure, see? Tell you what he used to do, at meals he'd peel his boiled potatoes, and he'd take out every little spot, no matter what kind, before he'd eat it. And if there was a red splotch on an egg, he'd scrape it off. Finally quit about the food. That's the kinda guy he was, clean. Used to dress up Sundays even when he wasn't going no place, put on a necktie even, and then set in the bunkhouse." "I ain't so sure," said George skeptically. "What did you say he quit for?" The old man put the yellow can in his pocket, and he rubbed his bristly white whiskers with his knuckles. Why? He just quit. The way a guy will. Says it was the food. Just wanted to move. Didn't give no other reason but the food. Just says, gimme my time one night, the way any guy would. George lifted his tick and looked underneath it. He leaned over and inspected the sacking closely. Immediately Lenny got up and did the same with his bed. Finally George seemed satisfied. He unrolled his bindle and put things on the shelf, his razor and bar of soap, his comb and bottle of pills, his liniment and leather wristband. Then he made his bed up neatly with blankets. The old man said, I guess the boss'll be out here in a minute. He was sure. Burned when you wasn't here this morning. Come right in when we was eatin' breakfast and says, where the hell's them new men? And he give the stable buck hell, too. George patted a wrinkle out of his bed, and sat down. Give the stable buck hell? He asked. Sure. You see the stable buck's a nigger. Nigger, huh? Yeah. Nice fella too. Got a crooked back where a horse kicked him. The boss gives him hell when he's mad. But the stable buck don't give a damn about that. He reads a lot. Got books in his room. What kind of a guy is the boss? George asked. Well, he's a pretty nice fella. Gets pretty mad sometimes, but he's pretty nice. Tell you what, know what he done Christmas? Bring a gallon of whiskey right in here and say, drink hearty. Boys. Christmas comes but once a year. The hell he did. Whole gallon? Yes sir. Jesus, we had fun. They let the nigger come in that night. Little Skinner name of Smithy took after the nigger. Done. Pretty good, too. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so the nigger got him. If he coulda used his feet, Smitty says he woulda killed the nigger. The guys said on account of the nigger's got a crooked back, Smitty can't use his feet. He paused in relish of the memory. After that the guys went into Soledad and raised hell. Didn't go in there. I ain't got the poop no more. Lenny was just finishing making his bed. The wooden latch raised again and the door opened. A little stocky man stood in the open doorway. He wore blue jean trousers, a flannel shirt, a black unbuttoned vest and a black coat. His thumbs were stuck in his belt, on each side of a square steel buckle. On his head was a soiled brown Stetson hat, and he wore high-heeled boots and spurs to prove he was not a laboring man. The old swamper looked quickly at him, and then shuffled to the door, rubbing his whiskers with his knuckles as he went. Them guys just come, he said, and shuffled past the boss and out the door. The boss stepped into the room with the short, quick steps of a fat-legged man. I wrote Murray and Reddy I wanted 2 men this morning. You got your work slips? George reached into his pocket and produced the slips and handed them to the boss. It wasn't Murray and Reddy's fault. Says right here on the slip that you was to be here for work this morning. George looked down at his feet. Bus driver give us a bum steer, he said. We had a walk 10 miles. Says we was here when we wasn't. We couldn't get no rides in the morning. The boss squinted his eyes. Well, I had to send out the grain. Team's short 2 buckers. Won't do any good to go out now till after dinner. He pulled his time book out of his pocket and opened it, where a pencil was stuck between the leaves. George scowled meaningfully at Lenny, and Lenny nodded to show that he understood. The boss licked his pencil. What's your name? George Milton. And what's yours? George said, his name's Lenny Small. The names were entered in the book. Lee C., this is the 20th, noon the 20th. He closed the book. Where you boys been working? Up around Weed, said George. You, too, to Lenny. Yeah, him too, said George. The boss pointed a playful finger at Lenny. No, he ain't, but he's sure a hell of a good worker. Strong as a bull. Lenny smiled to himself. Strong as a bull, he repeated. George scowled at him, and Lenny dropped his head in shame at having forgotten. The boss said suddenly, Listen, Small. Lenny raised his head. What can you do? In a panic, Lenny looked at George for help. He can do anything. You tell him, said George. He a good skinner. He can wrestle grain bags, drive cultivator. He can do anything. Just give him a try. The boss turned on George. Then why don't you let him answer? What are you trying to put over? George broke in loudly, Oh. I ain't saying he's bright. He ain't. But I say he's a goddamn good worker. He can put up a 400-pound bale. The boss deliberately put the little book in his pocket. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and squinted one eye nearly closed. Huh. I said, what stake you got in this guy? You keen. His pay away from him? No, course I ain't. Why you think I'm sellin' him out? Well, I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy. I just like to know what your interest is. George said, he's my cousin. I told his old lady I'd take care of him. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. He's alright. Just ain't bright. But he can do anything you tell him. The boss turned half away. Well, God knows we don't need any brains to buck barley bags. Rut, don't you try to put nothing over Milton. I got my eye on you. Why'd you quit in Weed? Job was done, said George promptly. What kinda job? We was diggin' a cesspool. All right. But don't try to put nothing over, 'cause you can't get away with nothing. I seen wise guys before. Go on out with the grain teams after dinner. They're pickin' up barley at the threshing machine. Go out with Slim's team. Slim? Yeah. Big tall Skinner. You'll see him at dinner. He turned abruptly and went to the door, but before he went out he turned and looked for a long moment at the two men. When the sound of his footsteps had died away, George turned on Lenny. So you wasn't gonna say a word? You was gonna leave your big flapper shut and leave me do the talkin'. Damn near lost us the job. Lenny stared hopelessly at his hands. I forgot George. Yeah, you forgot. You always forget, and I got to talk you out of it. He sat down heavily on the bunk. Now he's got his eye on us. Now we got to be careful and not make no slips. You keep your big wrapper shut after this. He fell morosely silent. George. What you want now? I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George? Be a damn good thing if you was, George said viciously. Save everybody a hell of a lot of trouble. You said I was your cousin, George. Well, that was a lie. And I'm damn glad it was. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself. He stopped suddenly, stepped to the open front door and peered out. Say, what the hell you doin'? Lightnin'? The old man came slowly into the room. He had his broom in his hand. And at his heels there walked a drag-footed sheepdog, gray of muzzle, and with pale, blind old eyes. The dog struggled lamely to dot either side of the room and lay down, grunting softly to himself and licking his grizzled, moth-eaten coat. The swamper watched him until he was settled. I wasn't listenin'. I was just standin' in the shade a minute scratchin' my dog. I just now finished swampin' out the wash house. You was pokin' your big ears into our business, George said. I don't like nobody to get nosy. The old man looked uneasily from George to Lenny, and then back. I just come there, he said. I didn't hear nothing you guys was sayin'. I ain't interested in nothing you was sayin'. A guy on a ranch don't never listen nor he don't ask no questions. Damn right he don't, said George, slightly mollified, not if he wants to stay workin' long. Rut he was reassured by the swamper's defense. Come on in and set down a minute, he said. That's a hell of an old dog. Yeah. I had him ever since he was a pup. God, he was a good sheep dog when he was younger. He stood his broom against the wall and he rubbed his white bristled cheek with his knuckles. How'd you like the boss? He asked. Pretty good. Seemed right. He's a nice fella, the swamper agreed. You got to take him. Right. At that moment a young man came into the bunkhouse, a thin young man with a brown face, with brown eyes and a head of tightly curled hair. He wore a work glove on his left hand, and like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. Seen my old man? He asked. The swamper said, he was here just a minute ago. Curly went over to the cookhouse, I think. I'll try to catch him, said Curly. His eyes passed over the new men and he stopped. He glanced coldly at George and then at Lenny. His arms gradually bent at the elbows and his hands closed into fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Lenny squirmed under the look and shifted his feet nervously. Curly stepped gingerly close to him. You the new guys the old man was waitin' for? We just come in, said George. Let the big gay talk. Lenny twisted with embarrassment. George said, "S'pose he don't want to talk." Curly lashed his body around. By Christ, he's gotta talk when he's spoke to. What the hell are you gettin' into it for? We travel together, said George coldly. Oh, so it's that way. George was tense and motionless. Yeah, it's that way. Lenny was looking helplessly to George for instruction. And Jan won't let the big guy talk, is that it? He can talk if he wants to tell you anything. He nodded slightly. To Lenny. We just come in, said Lenny softly. Curly stared levelly at him. Well, next time you answer when you're spoke to. He turned toward the door and walked out, and his elbows were bent out a little. George watched him out, and then he turned back to the swamper. Say, what the hell's he got on his shoulder? Lenny didn't do nothing to him. The old man looked cautiously at the door to make sure no one was listening. That's the boss's son, he said quietly. Curly's pretty handy. He done quite a bit in the ring. He's a lightweight. And he's handy. Well, let him be handy, said George, he don't have to take after Lenny. Lenny didn't do nothing to him. What's he got against Lenny? The swamper considered. Well, tell you what. Curly's like a lot of little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys. Kind of like he's mad at them because he ain't a big guy. You seen little guys like that, ain't you? Always scrappy. Sure, said George. I seen plenty tough little guys. But this. Curly better not make no mistakes about Lenny. Lenny ain't handy, but this Curly punk is gonna get hurt if he messes around with Lenny. Well, Curly's pretty handy, the swamper said skeptically. Never did seem right to me. S'pose Curly jumps a big guy and licks him. Everybody says what a game guy Curly is. And s'pose he does the same thing and gets licked. Then everybody says the big guy ought to pick somebody his own size, and maybe they gang up on the big guy. Never did seem right to me. Seems like Curly ain't given nobody a chance. George was watching the door. He said ominously, well, he better watch out for Lenny. Lenny ain't no fighter, but Lenny's strong and quick, and Lenny don't know no rules. He walked to the square table and sat down on one of the boxes. He gathered some of the cards together and shuffled them. The old man sat down on another box. Don't tell Curly I said none of this. He'd slough me. He just don't give a damn. Won't ever get canned, 'cause his old man's the boss. George cut the cards and began turning them over, looking at each one and throwing it down on a pile. He said, this guy Curly sounds like a son of a bitch to me. I don't like mean little guys. Seems to me like he's worse lately, said the swamper. He got married a couple of weeks ago. Wife lives over in the boss's house. Seems like Curie is cockier 'n ever since he got married. George grunted, maybe he's showin' off for his wife. The swamper warmed to his gossip. You seen that glove on his left hand? Yeah. I seen it. Well, that glove's full of Vaseline. Vaseline? What the hell for? Well, I tell you what, Curly says he's keepin' that hand soft for his wife. George studied the cards absorbedly. That's a dirty thing to tell around, he said. The old man was reassured. He had drawn a derogatory statement from George. He felt safe now, and bespoke more confidently. Wait till you see Curly's wife. George cut the cards again and put out a solitaire lay, slowly and deliberately. Putty? He asked casually. Yeah. Putty. But dash. George studied his cards. But what? Well, she got the eye. Yeah. Married 2 weeks and got the eye. Maybe that's why. Curly's pants is full of ants. I seen her give Slim the eye. Slim's a jerk-line skinner. Hell of a nice fella. Slim don't need to wear no high-heeled boots on a grain team. I seen her give Slim the eye. Curly never seen it. And I seen her give Carlson the eye. George pretended a lack of interest. Looks like we was gonna have fun. The swamper stood up from his box. Know what I think? George did not answer. Well, I think Curly's married a tart. He ain't the first, said George. There's plenty done that. The old man moved toward the door, and his ancient dog lifted his head and peered about, and then got painfully to his feet to follow. I gotta be settin' out the wash basins for the guys. The teams'll be in before long. You guys gonna buck barley? Yeah. You won't tell Curly nothing I said? Hell no. Well, you look her over, mister. You see if she ain't a tart. He stepped out the door into the brilliant sunshine. George laid down his cards thoughtfully, turned his piles of 3. He built 4 clubs on his ace pile. The sun square was on the floor now, and the flies whipped through it like sparks. A sound of jingling harness and the croak of heavy-laden axles sounded from outside.